In a land where the cold could swallow you whole, one man dared to build against the odds. Amidst the frozen wilderness, a settler's ambitious dream to harness the warmth of the sun stands tall, a cabin that survives the harshest winter without a single fire. The walls are his answer to a relentless season. But can ingenuity outlast nature's fury? Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will reveal how one man's vision changed everything for those who came after him. The wind howled through the snow-covered trees, whipping around the rugged landscape of the northern frontier. A lone settler, dressed in thick furs and woolen pants, stood at the edge of his property, staring at the mountains in the distance. His name was Joseph Trent, and for years he had endured the suffocating cold of these winter months, each one colder than the last. The winds had a way of creeping through every crack and crevice of his cabin, leaving him always on edge, wondering if this winter would be the one that broke him. But this year was different. Joseph had spent the better part of the summer planning and sketching his designs, pushing the limits of what he had been taught about frontier living. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living with dignity, warmth, and a sense of comfort in a place that otherwise demanded submission. His cabin, now nearing completion, stood like an outpost of civilization in a hostile, endless white. Its most remarkable feature was its walls, massive glass panes framed in rough-hewn logs, angled to capture every precious moment of sunlight. While other settlers clung to tried-and-true methods of cabin building, Joseph's vision was something different. He believed the sun could be his ally, that light, not fire, could heat his home. He had seen it work in the southern territories, where sun-soaked adobe houses kept warmth long into the night. The frontier was different, but Joseph had no intention of following the path others had walked. If he could harness sunlight in this cold, unforgiving land, he could create a life unlike any the wilderness had seen. His hands, calloused from years of hard labor, were stained with pitch from the roof and dusted with snow as he carefully examined the large glass panels of his wall. They gleamed in the dim light, reflecting the barren trees and the white landscape beyond. It wasn't perfect, but nothing ever was out here. He had faced skepticism from the beginning. Most of his fellow settlers thought he was mad, wasting precious resources that could have been spent on a more traditional cabin. But Joseph didn't mind. He had always been an outsider, a dreamer, in a place where only the strong and pragmatic survived. With winter fast approaching, Joseph had already placed his bets. His cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was a statement. It was the promise of warmth in a place where warmth was a luxury few could afford. And as the first snow began to fall, the real test was about to begin. The wind roared outside Joseph's cabin, but inside there was silence. It was the kind of silence that filled a man with both hope and dread. For the first time, Joseph stood alone in his creation, the glass walls glowing faintly from the warmth of the afternoon sun still trapped inside. The fire had long gone out, and yet the temperature within was remarkably bearable. He had stayed inside most of the day, watching as the sunlight poured through the large glass panes, filling the room with warmth that seemed to linger long after the sun dipped below the horizon. The design, he hoped, would work. But the true test would come when the temperature plunged and the winds began their relentless assault. Joseph had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He had fortified the walls, reinforced the glass with sturdy wooden framing, and added thick layers of insulation behind the panels. The cabin's orientation, too, was strategic, facing due south to maximize sunlight exposure during the shortest days of the year. Joseph had done everything he could to ensure that no part of the cabin would let in the icy breath of winter. As night fell, the temperature outside plummeted. Joseph felt a slight chill at the edge of his skin, a reminder that even his ambitious design was not foolproof. He stoked the fire in the stove and wrapped himself in thick blankets, unsure of what the morning would bring. The crackling fire gave off a comforting heat, but it was not the warmth he truly needed. It was the sun, and for now it was gone. The hours stretched on in an uneasy quiet, with only the sound of wind against the walls. Joseph lay awake, staring at the glass, watching the shadows of trees bend in the gusts. He was exhausted, but his mind raced. The fire could only do so much. His cabin was designed to be self-sustaining, a retreat from the cold, not a fortress. But his faith in his creation began to waver. Was this truly the answer to surviving winters on the frontier, or had he made a grave mistake? Around midnight, he rose to check the temperature. The stove was still warm, and the cabin's interior was just above freezing. Not ideal, but far from the bitter cold outside. He had prepared for worse. With a sigh, he returned to bed, adjusting his blankets. Tomorrow would be the real test. If the sun didn't rise, or if the clouds rolled in, his experiment would fail. And failure, in this unforgiving land, meant more than just a cold night. It meant survival was no longer guaranteed. By morning, Joseph awoke to a dull light filtering through the glass walls, casting long, muted shadows across the cabin floor. The storm had begun in the night, slowly creeping up from the mountains and swallowing the landscape in an endless veil of white. The wind howled with ferocity, a constant reminder of the harshness outside. Yet inside the cabin, it was remarkably quiet, save for the faint crackling of the stove still radiating warmth. Joseph rose from his bed, still wrapped in his thick woolen blankets, and made his way to the window. His breath fogged up the glass as he peered out into the snowstorm. He could barely see the trees now, only the swirling, ever-moving whiteness of the blizzard. The sun was hidden behind thick, angry clouds, its light all but blocked out by the oncoming storm. He'd known this might happen. The sun wasn't always a guaranteed ally, especially in the depths of winter. His heart sank. Without sunlight, the cabin's design would be tested beyond its limits. He quickly moved to check the temperature inside, his boots crunching against the wooden floor as he walked. The warmth from the previous day had already begun to dissipate. The chill from the outside wind crept through the cracks in the wood, and he could feel the cold bite at the edges of the room. It wasn't unbearable, but it was enough to make him uneasy. Joseph stoked the fire, adding logs to the stove and adjusting the vent to let the heat circulate better. He moved around the cabin, checking each window and making sure the seals were tight. It was a careful dance, managing the warmth, keeping the heat from escaping, while ensuring the air could still circulate. The large glass panes he had relied on to trap the sun's heat now felt like a liability. He had designed the cabin to rely on natural sunlight, but in the absence of that warmth, his reliance on the fire was growing. The storm raged on through the afternoon, and as dusk began to fall, Joseph found himself sitting by the stove, staring at the walls of his cabin. He was becoming increasingly aware of how much he was depending on that fire. If it went out, he would be in serious trouble. The fire was his safety net, his backup plan, but it wasn't supposed to be the heart of his design. The cabin had been meant to be self-sufficient, a testament to his faith in the power of sunlight and clever design. Now, with no sun and no heat source outside, Joseph began to question the very foundation of his vision. As the wind howled louder outside, Joseph's thoughts shifted. There was no turning back now. This storm could be a turning point, a failure, or a triumph. He could feel the weight of it pressing in around him. The dream of living comfortably in the wilderness was still alive, but it was teetering on the edge. The storm had made him realize that his creation, no matter how strong or clever, was still fragile in the face of nature's raw power. He would have to fight not only the weather, but his own doubts too. The night passed slowly. Joseph woke several times, listening to the wind shrieking through the trees, the sound of the storm battering against the glass. Despite the fire in the stove, The chill that had crept into the air earlier remained stubbornly present. The cabin was still, warm enough to survive, but not comfortable enough to feel secure. Joseph wrapped himself in blankets, hoping the warmth would stay just a little longer, but he couldn't shake the anxiety gnawing at him. The next morning he knew he had to assess the damage. The storm had raged through the night, and the sun was still hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. Stepping out of his cabin, Joseph immediately felt the bite of the cold. The snow had piled up around the edges of the cabin, and the air was sharp, cutting straight through his heavy furs. The wind had calmed slightly, but was still harsh, blowing gusts of snow across the ground in swirling patterns. Joseph walked around the cabin, inspecting the glass walls. The panes were frosted over, but they still stood strong. He had expected the worst, cracks, the glass shattering under the weight of the storm, but it had held, for now at least. There were other issues to contend with, however. The snow had piled up around the foundation, and he could feel the cold creeping in from the ground. His design had considered the walls and roof, but not the floor. The insulation he had used was doing its best, but the heat loss from the ground was a flaw he hadn't accounted for. As he returned inside, Joseph's mind raced. There were solutions to these problems, he knew that. A new foundation, thicker insulation, maybe even a new approach to the walls that didn't rely so heavily on sunlight. He could modify it, make it better. But what gnawed at him wasn't the storm or the cold. It was the fact that he'd designed this cabin to work without relying on fire, yet here he was, clinging to the stove to keep warm. His creation wasn't living up to the promise he had made to himself. The fire was now low, and Joseph stoked it once more, watching the flames leap and flicker. His fingers itched for something to do, something to fix. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been too idealistic, too focused on building something that looked different, without considering how the elements would really interact with his vision. The cold outside wasn't just cold, it was a constant force, never ceasing, never allowing comfort without effort. It was clear now. He would need to rethink his strategy, but the dream of a self-sustaining cabin powered by nothing but the sun and the ingenuity of its builder was still alive in him. He would adapt, push forward, but for now, the storm had claimed its victory. The sun might return, and so might his hope, but for now, he would have to rely on the fire, just like everyone else. The real test, Joseph realized, was learning when to accept help from the old ways, and when to forge new ones. Days passed, and the storm never fully relented. Joseph found himself in a constant state of vigilance, both against the biting cold and the creeping doubt that slowly took root in his mind. Every morning he awoke to the same bleak gray sky, the sun still hidden behind these thick clouds. His cabin was still standing, the glass walls holding firm, but the warmth he had hoped for was a distant dream. The stove, his backup plan, had become his lifeline. He stoked it throughout the day, and each time he did, the fire seemed a little harder to keep going. The insulation underfoot, a combination of earth and straw, was doing what it could, but it wasn't enough. Joseph could feel the cold seeping in from the floor, from every crack in the foundation he had failed to account for. The large glass walls, which he had believed would trap heat from the sunlight, had become a liability. When the clouds came in, as they had in the last few days, they offered no warmth, no protection. The cold was relentless. He had underestimated it. And now every hour he spent inside, shivering despite the fire, was a reminder of his mistake. He couldn't help but reflect on the decision he'd made all those months ago when he first began the ambitious project. He'd seen so much promise in his design, so much hope. The warmth from the sun would fill his cabin, and he would sit in comfort watching the snowstorms rage outside, knowing he had conquered the frontier's harshest elements. But it hadn't turned out that way. The reality of winter on the frontier was far harsher than he had imagined. There was no compromise with nature, no design, no clever idea could make it less cruel. As Joseph sat by the fire, his fingers aching from the cold, he thought about the other settlers, the ones who built their cabins the old way. They had firewood stacked high, thick walls to protect them from the biting wind, and their cabins were always warm when the cold came. Joseph had been so certain that his vision would work, but now it felt foolish. His obsession with innovation had blinded him to the basic principles of survival. But even as the doubt weighed heavily on his shoulders, there was a stubborn part of him that refused to give up. He couldn't let go of the dream, not yet. There had to be a way to make it work. If he could endure this winter, if he could adapt and learn from the mistakes he had made, maybe he could make the cabin truly self-sustaining. He would find a solution. He had no choice. The fire flickered low as the evening wore on, and Joseph wrapped himself tighter in his furs. The storm had not let up, but in the quiet of the cabin, the cold felt less oppressive. It was still a battle, but now he understood something fundamental about himself. He wasn't just fighting against the elements. He was fighting for something more than survival. He was fighting for a dream, for a vision that could change the way people lived in this unforgiving land. A few weeks had passed since the storm, and Joseph had spent every day trying to make peace with the flaws of his design. The storm, with its fierce winds and relentless snow, had exposed the cracks in his vision, but Joseph was not one to surrender easily. In the silence of his cabin, surrounded by the howling winds outside, he had begun to rethink everything. He spent his days in quiet contemplation, considering every detail of his construction, every choice he had made, and how each could be improved. The glass walls had been a noble experiment, but they weren't enough to survive in the harsh wilderness. He would need to find a way to use those walls more efficiently. And as he thought about the problems he had encountered, a new idea began to form, a combination of old and new techniques, a marriage of the tried and tested methods of frontier building with the innovative design he had tried to bring to life. The first step was to address the floor. The earth had been a good insulator, but it wasn't enough to keep the heat from escaping. Joseph had an idea. If he could create a double-layer floor, using both straw and a thicker layer of clay, it would act as a more effective insulator. Clay, he knew, could hold heat better than anything else. It had been used in other regions for building homes that retained warmth even through the coldest nights. If he could combine this with his existing design, he might be able to keep the warmth inside the cabin for longer. The next challenge was the roof. Joseph had been too focused on the walls and the floor, but the roof was another crucial element. The thatched roofs of the other cabins were functional, but they didn't offer the same kind of protection from the elements as a solid roof might. He had seen designs that used a layer of clay and straw beneath the shingles, creating an air barrier that kept the cabin warmer in the winter. It was time to apply that principle to his cabin. And then there was the issue of the glass. Joseph couldn't get rid of the glass walls entirely. They were too central to his vision. But he could adapt. He could add a layer of insulating material to the inside of the glass, something that could trap more warmth without losing the sunlight he had relied on. He had some old animal pelts that he had been saving. They could be used to cover the glass when the sun was gone, helping to preserve the heat that had been absorbed during the day. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be a start. The fire in the stove crackled softly as Joseph began to gather his materials. He had a long road ahead, but this time he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The dream wasn't over. He could still make his cabin work. He just had to be willing to adapt, to listen to the land, and to accept that innovation was a process, not a one-time solution. It was time to reinvest in his vision, to rebuild it, with the lessons he had learned. With every new idea that took shape in his mind, Joseph felt the weight of the winter lift just a little. There would still be difficult days ahead, but now he had a plan. And for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Joseph had spent the better part of the past week working tirelessly, making modifications to his cabin, each change a calculated risk. The days seemed to blur together in a haze of cold mornings and freezing nights. the wind never relenting as it howled through the trees outside. But inside the cabin was becoming something more than he had ever imagined. Slowly, inch by inch, the warmth he sought was beginning to seep into the walls of his home, and for the first time in weeks, Joseph allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The first change he made was to the floor. He had worked late into the nights, mixing the clay with straw, forming a thick, insulating layer that would trap the heat from the stove beneath the cabin's surface. The transformation was immediate. As he stepped onto the newly laid floor, Joseph could feel a slight warmth radiating from below, a subtle but noticeable shift. The chill that had once crept up from the ground was gone, replaced by a comforting heat that seemed to radiate throughout the cabin. It wasn't a drastic change, but it was enough to make the air feel less oppressive. Next, he focused on the glass walls. Joseph had always known that the glass alone wouldn't be enough to keep the warmth in when the sun set. His solution had been a simple one, a layer of thick animal pelts draped over the inside of the glass. He'd spent days stretching and tacking them into place, carefully sealing the edges with strips of old canvas. When he finished, the glass panes were covered, insulating the cabin further. The pelts added a rustic charm to the walls, but more importantly, they worked. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Joseph could already feel the difference. The warmth from the day was trapped inside, preserved by the thick layers of fabric. The cold from outside no longer gnawed at the edges of his home. The final change came with the roof. Joseph had carefully layered straw beneath the shingles, adding a coat of clay and earth on top of it all. The roof now acted as an extra layer of insulation, blocking the wind and keeping the warmth inside. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. For the first time, he felt the cabin shift from a space of struggle into a refuge. That night, as he sat by the fire, Joseph marveled at how the cabin felt different. The air inside was warmer than it had ever been during a winter storm. The fire crackled gently, not working overtime to fight the cold, but rather serving as a supplemental warmth, a comfort. Joseph pulled his blanket tighter around himself, his eyes closing for a moment as he allowed himself to rest, knowing that his adjustments were finally taking hold. But even as the warmth settled in, Joseph was aware that the battle was far from over. The storm raged on outside, the winds howling and the snow falling in thick layers. The true test of his creation was yet to come. But tonight, at least, he could sleep soundly. He had built something that worked, not perfectly, but enough to make him believe that survival could be more than just enduring. It could be about thriving, even in the coldest of winters. The following morning, the storm had subsided, leaving behind a landscape transformed into a pristine, white wonderland. The air was still, the cold lingering in the quiet, but the sun was finally visible, peeking through the parting clouds. Joseph stood by the glass wall, watching as the first rays of sunlight struck the snow, sending glimmers of gold across the landscape. He breathed in deeply, the cold air sharp but invigorating. The world outside was still frozen, but the cabin, his cabin, was warm, glowing in the early morning light. The fire from the previous night had burned low but steady. The pelts had done their job, and the cabin felt stable, insulated against the cruel cold outside. As Joseph moved through the cabin, checking the floors, the walls, and the roof, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He had done it. He had created a space that could withstand the brutal forces of nature, a refuge against the elements. With each passing hour, Joseph saw his vision taking shape more clearly. The sun came streaming through the glass walls, and the warmth, though gentle, filled the room. The heat from the floor, the insulation, and the clever use of the sun's energy had all come together. The fire, while still needed, wasn't the focal point anymore. The cabin was beginning to hold warmth on its own. As the day wore on, Joseph's confidence grew. The storm may have tested him, but it had also taught him lessons he would carry forward. He had learned to balance innovation with practicality, to acknowledge the power of nature while still pushing the boundaries of what was possible. It wasn't about building a perfect cabin, it was about building one that could survive, one that could evolve and adapt. And that, Joseph realized, was the true spirit of the frontier. By dusk, the cabin was still warm. The sun had set. But the heat from the day's sunlight had been preserved, and the fire in the stove was now a mere comfort, not a necessity. Joseph stepped outside to survey the land, the cabin standing proud against the backdrop of the wilderness. It was a symbol of resilience, of a man who refused to accept the limitations of the land and instead sought to adapt, to learn, and to grow. For the first time since he had started this journey, Joseph felt at peace. The dream of a self-sustaining cabin wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a reality, forged through trial, failure, and the relentless pursuit of something greater. The cold, once a formidable enemy, no longer felt so overpowering. And though there would be more winters, more challenges to face, Joseph knew now that his cabin would survive, and so would he. The dream, finally realized, stood strong as the dawn of a new life. The days grew longer as winter slowly gave way to the quiet promise of spring. Joseph's cabin, once a test of ambition and innovation, had become something far more profound. It was a place of refuge, not just for him, but for the surrounding wilderness, standing as a testament to the ingenuity that had been woven into its very structure. The changes he had made, from the insulated floor to the clever use of animal pelts and the reinforced roof, had transformed his home into something he could rely on, even in the harshest weather. It wasn't just a shelter anymore, it was a success. As the snows began to melt, Joseph found himself spending more time outside, assessing the landscape, making small repairs, and collecting firewood for the next winter. But even as he worked, his mind kept returning to the design of his cabin. It was as though the process of creation had awakened something deeper in him, a sense of pride not just in the survival of the structure, but in the way he had adapted to the land. But there was more than just pride in his work. Over the weeks, word of Joseph's cabin had spread through the nearby settlements, and fellow settlers began to visit, curious about his methods. They came not just for the novelty of the design, but to learn. Joseph found himself showing others how to layer the straw beneath the shingles, how to use pelts to insulate windows, how to combine traditional building methods with innovative ideas. His cabin had become more than just a home. It had become a symbol, a beacon of possibility for those struggling to survive in the unforgiving wilderness. One afternoon, a group of settlers arrived, bringing with them a young family in tow. They were new to the area, struggling to make a living in the cold, and Joseph saw in them the same uncertainty he had once felt. They asked about his cabin, his design, and the stories of his success in surviving the storms. Joseph welcomed them into his home, showing them the changes he had made, explaining each step of the process. It was with quiet pride that he realized just how much his creation had changed his life and the lives of others. As he stood there talking with the settlers, Joseph understood something that had been eluding him. The true value of his innovation wasn't just in how it helped him survive. It was in how it had the potential to change others' lives as well. His ideas, once ridiculed as impractical, were now being embraced, tested, and adapted by others in the community. The dream he had clung to, the vision of a cabin that could stand against the cold without the constant need for firewood, was no longer just his own. It was something that could help a whole community thrive in the harshest of winters. As the settlers left, expressing their gratitude and plans to build similar cabins, Joseph felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had not only built a home for himself, he had built a legacy. The cold of winter still held its power, but now it no longer felt like an insurmountable enemy. The frontier had a new way of surviving, a new hope, and it was one born from Joseph's resilience and his refusal to accept defeat. Spring arrived quietly, as it always did, melting the last of the snow and bringing new life to the land. Joseph could feel the shift in the air as the earth began to warm. The harshness of winter, though never forgotten, had lost its grip on him. The cabin stood firm, its walls now a familiar sight, and he had long since stopped worrying about the cold. It was a place of comfort now, of refuge, and Joseph had grown to understand that this cabin was not just a physical structure, but a living testament to his journey, to the trials and triumphs that had shaped his life. As the days grew warmer, Joseph spent more time outdoors, working the land, planting seeds for the coming summer, and making small improvements to his home. He repaired the roof after the winter's storms, checked the walls for any damage, and prepared for the next season. But it wasn't just physical work that occupied his mind. Joseph often found himself reflecting on everything he had learned throughout the past year, on the changes he had made to his cabin, and how far he had come from the uncertain man who had first arrived on this land. The loneliness of the frontier had never been something he feared, but now it felt like a companion he had come to know intimately. It was a quiet kind of solitude, one that allowed him the space to think, to grow, and to rebuild not just the structure of his cabin, but the structure of his life. In the months since the storm had tested him, Joseph had learned the value of patience and adaptation. He had learned that survival was not just about fighting against nature, but about working with it, learning from it, and adjusting when needed. On a cool evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Joseph stood outside the cabin, gazing out over the land he had come to call home. The world was still wild, still untamed, but it was no longer an enemy. The cabin, with its glass walls and thoughtful design, was proof of that. It was proof that with time, ingenuity, and perseverance, anything could be achieved. Joseph knew the future would bring more challenges, more storms, and more trials, but he no longer feared them. The cabin, built with his own hands, was a symbol of strength and resilience. It was a symbol of his own journey, a journey that had started with a dream and had led to a legacy that would live on long after the winter's cold had passed. And so, as the first flowers of spring bloomed around him, Joseph Trent stood at the threshold of his cabin, knowing that he had built more than just a home. He had built a future, one where survival wasn't just a matter of enduring, but of thriving. And that, he realized, was the true power of his creation. The storm had passed. The cold had lost its bite. And Joseph, standing at the edge of his cabin, watched the sun set on a new beginning, knowing that whatever came next, he would face it with the same strength and ingenuity that had brought him here.